Hello everyone and welcome to today's video. Today we are going to look at the third and final scenario from the Cthulhu Confidential core book. If you don't already know, this is a one-to-one investigative horror RPG set in America in the 1930s, 1940s. It uses the Gumshoe one-to-one system by Pelgrane Press. If you want to know more, I have an overview of this system. As I mentioned, this is the third scenario in the book, so go check out my reviews for the first two scenarios if you haven't already. So, Cthulhu Confidential is a little bit different in that it introduces a character, in this case Langston, and a city, Wartime Washington Dc, in good detail before getting to the scenario. In this review, we will look at the character, the city, and finally the scenario. For players, you can safely watch the first two sections without spoilers. But if you are a player who hasn't played through this already, if you watch the scenario review, you will spoil the adventure for yourself. I'll pop up a spoiler warning just before we get to that. Okay, so let's get started by introducing our character, Langston Montgomery Wright, who is described as a down-on-his-luck, wounded war hero turned two-bit Seamus, fighting for those who have no one else. There's a lot of political corruption and rampant racism, and Langston has to do his best to make the hard choices no matter the cost. He'll try to give people just that one extra day of hope, something to make life easier, even if just for a short while. I love this because it's very Lovecraftian, and the RPG Delta Green deals with it really well. Knowing that we are doomed or cosmically insignificant, but shielding people from that knowledge and allowing them to live in peaceful ignorance just a little bit longer. In Langston's case, the existential threat also includes the rampant racism. So in his history, Langston saved about a dozen people at an Axis attack in Casablanca, but he took a lot of shrapnel in his body, so he was honorably discharged and sent back home. He works one day a week at an observatory. He also has use of a car, which is on loan from a friend, but his friend might take it back at any point. And generally the vibe is that the government won't really provide for a returned black veteran. After reading this, I presume that this whole scenario was helmed by Chris Spivey, as there are echoes of the same in the critically acclaimed Harlem Unbound for Call of Cthulhu. In that one, he's particularly talking about the Harlem Hellfighters. Anyway, we move on to personalizing Langston with 5 questions. So, I'll show the questions here. Straight from the book. To make Langston more personal, have the player answer the following questions. 1. Langston had 5 siblings, but they didn't all survive to adulthood. How many died, and how? 2. What is Langston's favorite drink? And so if you don't know, they give suggestions. Bourbon is always a nice classic, if in doubt. Number 3. Is Langston religious? If so, what religious? If not, why not? And remember, this is 1940s America. So what would a black veteran feel? Religious or not? And why not? And question 4. What does he enjoy most about his one day a week at the Naval Observatory? And the last question is, Langston is a week behind on the rent. How did he handle his landlord when he met him yesterday? So these are all ways for the player to personalize the character. So after this, we find out about his friends. There's William, or Wild Bill Donovan, who was a diplomat and now works in the intelligence agency. He noticed Langston's ability with languages and hired him on as a code breaker, kind of under the radar. So as a black man, Langston could be invisible in certain situations, which obviously is a help for espionage. And this Wild Bill is the friend who lent the car to Langston. Detective Calvin Watts is a black police officer, which is rare at the time. He respects Langston and will offer some help, but always at a price. Miguel Balcazar is a dock worker, a Hispanic dock worker who just does his work quietly, but on occasion he has been known to maybe misplace a crate or two, and he can give Langston information about anything that's happening at the docks. Laura Wayne is the owner of Langston's favourite jazz club where he goes to relax. They were romantically involved in the past, but they're just friends now. And finally, we have James Jackson, who is Langston's friend who works at the Pentagon. But James really wants to be an actor, and so he can offer Langston a lot of advice on mannerisms or how to play a different identity when needed, and to do so convincingly. Okay, so now we turn on to the main sources. So in Cthulhu Confidential, it's not reasonable, or in any investigative game, it's not reasonable that one player will have all of the knowledge and be able to handle every situation. In a multiplayer game, that's sorted by having multiple players with different specialities. In a one-to-one game, you only have one player. So to make this more realistic and also very thematic for the film noir style, they have sources they can consult on different matters. So our first source is Rosamund Carter. She is a professor in Howard University, teaching sociology and anthropology. She absolutely believes in the supernatural, whereas Langston is more focused on science. She's always happy to give him any information, even hinting at Cthulhu mythos, but she never wants to tell him exactly the story. She wants to give him the information and for him to reach his own conclusions. After that, we have Myrna Betty Cohen, who is an insider at the Department of Agriculture, and she is a very charismatic woman. She can always take control of a room. She is the fiance of Hal Rappaport, one of the 12 men that Langston saved in Casablanca. So Myrna feels it's her responsibility to look out for Langston, despite Langston's protests, and Myrna is really, she has decided, I'm going to find Langston a wife. She has a lot of information about the war, about any foreign diplomats, and about the law as well. And next up we have Reverend Ernest Thompson, who used to be very strong and muscular, but he's been getting a little bit softer in the years. He is 66, but still full of energy. He was a chaplain and a medic for African Americans in World War I, and is really personally devastated by the treatment of colored veterans when they return home. In the past, he went to Langston to solve a murder of one of his church members. Up next is Cornelius, or Scout, Moore, who is a journalist and always has a camera with him and always looking for the next groundbreaking story. His parents were killed by the KKK in Alabama, and he is actually Langston's cousin, but they act more like brothers. He tried to enlist in the army in 1941, but he was turned away. He's very small and slight. And finally, for the sources, we have Lieutenant Colonel Melvin Hartman, who is an officer of the OSS, or the Office of Strategic Services. He is also short and slight, but he uses people's underestimation of him to his advantage. He is a gay man serving in the military, so he keeps his secrets close. He worked with Langston in the OSS, and they respect each other. He also loves to see Langston solving crimes. Melvin likes to offer advice and likes to think of himself, as the book says, Melvin thinks of himself as Mycroft to Langston's Sherlock. Okay, so before we move on to the city proper, there is an additional section on wartime in the States. So when it joined World War II, America focused a lot on production, which essentially got rid of unemployment from the Great Depression, And companies were also forced to accept women and people of color. So this really, really helped to change the country. Rationing was a serious thing, and in particular, gas ration stickers were important. Depending on your designation, you could get just a certain amount of gas. And that might be interesting in some of Langston's scenarios. But even though, for example, black people were now getting employed, racial tensions were still rising. Probably as a result of minorities beginning to work, but also there was wider consciousness of the hypocrisy of America fighting for equality abroad while not treating its own citizens equally. The book goes into more detail on this too. And finally, just before the city, we get a day in the life of Langston, which I will just briefly summarize here. He goes to a diner, he grabs coffee and a paper. Often he is interrupted by one of the members of the community looking for his help. He goes to the observatory for work once a week. Here it discusses the policy of back of the bus and coloured only drinking fountains and not being able to enter through the main door because he's black. He is more intelligent and educated than many of his co-workers, but he's always given only the simplest of tasks. And they make a note of saying that he is called boy if he makes any misstep. After work, he heads back to a black-friendly bar, and anytime he's walking, he always goes the long way to avoid being accosted by police for being in the wrong area. Okay, so next we move on to the city, which is Wartime Dc. The city has a lot of anti-aircraft guns around it, and all of the spotlights in the city are ordered off. So as not to attract any air raid attention. So the city has a very ominous feeling to it. There are a number of new government agencies popping up, like the War Production Board and the Office of Strategic Service. The average salary was about $2,000 to $3,000 a year, and usually about half of that went to food and a bed. And work was at least 50 hours a week. When the new workers started flooding in, more production, more jobs, there was not enough housing, so there's a lot of alley cities to squeeze people in. So pretty poor accommodation just to squeeze as many people as possible in. But despite all of the hardships in the city, this also created a bond where everyone's kind of sacrificing for the greater good. There's also a lot of military present in the city, which cuts down on criminal activity. So people are feeling a little bit safer as well. And next we get a little bit of history about the city before moving on to the different areas. I won't go into the history too much, but the main quadrants are the Northwest, which is quite an affluent area with the White House, with Howard University, with the Howard Theatre, and the Octagon House, which is a famous haunted house, which is actually a hexagon. And it has some other interesting buildings, department stores, temples, hotels, and restaurants. So lots of details there. In the Northeast, this is home to most of the African Americans who have made their way up to DC. And it also has the capital, which houses Congress. There is also a big housing project there, the Langston Terrace Dwellings. There's Union Station and the Air Raid Warden Headquarters. And again, the book has a lot more detail about all of these. Next we read about the Southwest Quadrant, which is the smallest, but it has the Smithsonian and some of the oldest and possibly haunted buildings in the city. The southeast section has the richest cultural history, which preserves aspects of the Civil War, and it also has the Washington Navy Yard. There's a list of other nearby places of note, which are the Pentagon, Arlington National Cemetery, and Washington National Airport. So after that brief geographic description, we learn a little bit more about the politics of the city. So there is no mayor, but there's a 3-member committee known as the Board of Commissioners, with 1 Democrat, 1 Republican, and 1 civil engineer. And all 3 of these are appointed by the president. I'm not sure if this is still the way that they do it in Washington DC, but I think that's quite an interesting way to do it. It's something I didn't know about it at all. So we're going to meet some of the important people here. So March Church Terrell is a civil rights and women's activist. Eleanor Patterson hates the president, Roosevelt, and thinks America should have remained isolated. She is the head of a newspaper and spreads her beliefs. Paulie Murray is a black grad student who will soon lead a co-ed sit-in at a white cafeteria. And there's a lot more interesting characters mentioned here too, but I can't give them all away in the video. So next we get a section on the Jim Crow laws, which establish etiquette that basically prevented black people from doing anything that might lead them to be seen as equal to whites. There is another subsection about the Negro Traveler's Green Book, which is the title of a guide helping African Americans to find safe places to travel in America, especially if they were families, to try and shield their children from the grim reality of going to the wrong place. So, of course, up until this point, there have been many mentions of the heavy theme of racism. For some people, including this in your game is great, and it gives a lot of realism. For others, not so much. And the book states the following. Wartime DC is written in a fashion that takes history into account, but plays it through a noir lens, which allows the GM and the player to decide the level of realism they wish to employ. I feel that this should always be the approach for games. Figure out what works for you and your players, and exploring these themes might be very enlightening, which is great, but it can also evoke strong reactions. So find the balance that works just right for you and your players. There is also a discussion on the differences between modern and historical racism in the US, and a note that the forthcoming scenario, capital colors, has icons called Handle with Care to alert GMs to potentially difficult situations. So I think that's always good. Just brings your awareness back. Maybe this is going to be a difficult scene. After that, we get the select bibliography to help you set the mood, and this also includes music this time. Okay, so after all of that, we are ready to move on to our scenario. After this point, there will be heavy spoilers. So if you're a player and don't want to have the adventure ruined, please stop watching now. As I mentioned before, one-to-one scenarios are particularly susceptible to being ruined if you know the plot. If you are a GM, or if you've already played the game, please feel free to keep watching. So, just before we get into this, and hopefully the spoiler warning has deterred all players, you might have already guessed from the title, but this scenario uses the Lovecraftian entity, the color out of space. Given the background up to this point, race does play a part, so it's a nice double meaning. However, the hint I'm talking about is the spelling of color, which uses the original English spelling with the U, which is what Lovecraft wrote when he wrote The Color Out of Space. The newer movie uses the American spelling with no U, but the original text says Colour, which is how it's presented for this. Anyway, we get a sidebar about the color, so even if you don't know about it, if you haven't read the book, if you haven't watched the movie, you can start off here. But basically, this entity, this color, comes from space, lands on different planets, in this case Earth. They feed on everything around them and utterly destroy them. And then once they are full, they go back to space. They tend to gradually feed on sources, or humans, because that way they can get maximum nutrients, rather than just gorging on a human all at once. They tend to leech off of them over an extended period. So once again, I will point out, as I did in the first and second scenario, that there is some inconsistency in the layout between the scenarios. We get introduced to the characters first and then read the backstory. But I think it flows much better if you read the background first and then have a summary of the characters. The second scenario has it in my preferred way, but I just don't know why there isn't consistency. But anyway, the story so far is, about 5 months ago there was a strange meteor shower in Virginia which contained the color out of space. The army went to check it out, just in case it was an Axis secret weapon. They removed most of the meteors and brought them to the Navy Munitions Plant Echo, where Walter Adams, a physicist, investigated them. The rocks showed signs of fission, and Walter knew this could make his career. This could make him really famous. But it's a bit too complicated to handle on his own. So he contacted one of his former professors, Boris Podolsky, who was working at the University of Cincinnati. And Boris got his position, in part thanks to a reference letter from Albert Einstein. Boris is a Soviet spy, however, and believes that this entity, this color out of space, could be better than uranium, so he wants to sell it to the Soviets. The pair, Walter and Boris, work on smaller or infant bits of the color, while a single adult color is trapped within a glass cage. So Walter's secret girlfriend, Lynette Miller, sneaks down to the lab to see him, but when she couldn't find him and heard footsteps, she hid. She witnesses Boris stealing some documents from the labs, but while doing so, while hiding, she accidentally touched an infant color who fed on her. Separately, Special Agent Ellison suspected Boris of being a spy, and he informed Director Hoover of his suspicions, but he still needed a bit more proof. So he snuck into the lab and startled the color, and then he shot at the color. This cracked the cage and containing the color, and the color fed on Ellison before he fled. Later, Walter went to work in the lab, and he didn't notice the crack. The deprived color then fed on him completely until he turned to ash. And Boris watched this in amazement. So as I mentioned, the color will normally just gradually leach off you, but in this case, I think the adult color had been deprived for so long, trapped inside this special glass cage. When the gunshot broke it, it got out and it wanted to feed completely, and it turned Walter to ash. So as I said, Boris watched in kind of pleased amazement at this. It's a little bit vague here, but it seems that Lynette also watched this, and she was terrified. So Lynette snuck into the lab twice and was watching Boris twice. But yeah, it seems that she watched this and was terrified by Boris's kind of happy reaction. But it also seems that Boris saw her there, but again, not so clear. She was sure that if she reported anything, Boris could just twist it around and make her look guilty. And he has references from Einstein and she's just a lowly worker. So she scribbled a letter down, or typed up a letter hastily, about her being transferred to a different department or a different city, and she sent that to her father. She then bought a gun for protection and fled to her secret boyfriend's house. Again, it's just a little bit vague here, but it seems that somehow some time passed between Walter's death and her coming to his house, because she went there because it had already been searched after his death, and she knows it won't be searched again. So the way I see it is that he died and she witnessed his death, and maybe she saw Boris and Boris saw her. She ran away, and she prepared everything. She got the money together to get a gun, and after a few days, I'm not sure exactly how she made it through those few days anyway, but then she went to his house, knowing that after a week maybe no one else would come. A little bit strange, but that's what I gather from it. Anyway, Boris evidently gives up on her for the moment, or knows that she is scared enough of him to not say anything. He plans to deliver the remaining shards of the meteorite to his contact Dmitri at Capital Traction Powerhouse in 4 days. Okay, so now we can look at the character map and hopefully understand it a little bit better. There are a few extra pieces here and a few extra characters here. Don't worry so much about them. Okay, so the main parts from the character map are that Lynette wrote a message to her father, but the message is a little bit mysterious and he thinks she is missing. Her father comes to Langston asking for help. Lynette is dating Russell Williams, but also has a secret boyfriend, Walter Adams. Walter Adams is a scientist working on the color, and his assistant is Boris Podolsky. Boris is being trailed by David Ellison, the special agent, and Boris is trying to sell his secrets to Dmitri, a Soviet spy. Dmitri has hired a hitman to take out Maurice Miller, Lynette's father, to stop any queries. And Lynette as well. Lynette's boyfriend's father, so Russell Williams' father, not Walter, Lynette's boyfriend's father is a pastor who is doing some shady things, which Lynette knows about. She blackmails him to get enough money to buy a gun from Rhino Jones to protect herself. A lot going on there, but once you read through it, it does make a lot more sense. It should come out naturally enough. So next, let's look at the scene flow. Again, in scenarios 1 and 3, this one, the scenes are labeled by type, while in scenario 2, they are not. I'm sure it's just an oversight, but a little bit more consistency in the layout would be great. Okay, so here we can see the kind of extra white borders are the core scenes. So these are the ones that you kind of need to solve the whole case. So again, we will only go through the core scenes for the sake of time, but the alternate scenes can be used to allow your player to investigate more and make the world seem deeper and more real. So we start off with Lynette was a riveter as the opening scene. There's a loud knock at Langston's door, and in comes a one-legged man, Maurice Miller, who just immediately starts blurting out his speech. His daughter has been missing for days, and the police won't help. She has been working as a riveter for 6 months, and she was a maid before that. She likes the new job because it is much better pay. For the last 2 months, Maurice has been seeing less of her, and not at all in 2 weeks. No one at her boarding house has seen her for a week. She left this transfer letter, but she'd never leave without telling Maurice. Maurice can show the letter, and Langston notices that it lacks the rhythm and the terminology of a normal military letter. It's also not on any letterhead, and there's something wrong about the kind of paper. Maurice wasn't particularly happy about her, a woman, doing the heavy duties of a man's work as a riveter, but they needed the money. He's convinced that she's single and he can provide a picture of her. She went to church a lot and she would call her father every day after work, even if it was just for a few minutes. And an important and interesting thing to point out to your players is that he will have to investigate, and it may involve driving, but don't forget, rationing is in full effect. Okay, so next scene. There are many scenes that you can go to from here, but I'll just go in the order in which it is presented in the book. So the next scene then is Holy Rollers, and this is the church that Lynette went to. And Langston soon meets Pastor Richard Williams. He'll chat about God and general affairs, but when the topic of Lynette comes up, he excuses himself. I have other things to attend to, and he directs Langston towards the choir director, James Turk. So you can play this any way you want. You can make him seem more suspicious as he's doing this, or you can just be like, oh, maybe James Turk, the choir director, would know her better. Whichever way. I would probably play it somewhere in the middle, not making him super obvious, super suspicious. But anyway, so talking to the choir director, James can tell Langston that Lynette has been a member of the choir since she was 7. She has a great voice and is secretly going out with the pastor's son for about a year. And this bit of information here is also can excuse maybe the pastor acting a little strangely. So that's nice there. If you push for more information, you can find out that Turk noticed a heated argument between Lynette and the pastor. And also, about a month ago, her voice and skin were showing signs of her wasting away. If you go to talk to the pastor about this, he won't elaborate on anything. But you can sneak in later and find out that he has been stealing from the church coffers. Lynette knew about it and blackmailed him for money to buy a gun. All of this is in a different alternate scene, so we won't go into too much here. Okay, so the next core scene that we could go to is called Unequal Housing, where Langston goes to Lynette's apartment. And after getting nowhere with the landlady, a black Latina, Alicia, comes to help Langston. She brings Langston to the apartment that she shared with Lynette. Langston can find pictures of Lynette with Russell Williams, the pastor's son, Lynette with Walter Adams, the scientist, and Lynette with Maurice, her father. So Alicia can tell Langston the following. Lynette had 2 boyfriends here and 3 fiancés overseas in the army, which was apparently typical at the time to give the soldiers hope. Lynette had been acting strangely for about a month. She sometimes doesn't come home at night, and when she did, she always checked the window to see if she was being followed. She asked Alicia, who also works with her, if she had seen the old Russian Jew, one of the professors from work, the scientists from work, around their housing building. She was losing a lot of weight, and her hair was falling out. So these are all signs, not just from the stress of the incident, but the colour was feeding off her. Alicia then tells the following in tears. She hasn't seen Lynette for a week, and the last time she saw her, she looked like she had been beaten and had burns all over her body. One night, Alicia saw a swirling rainbow of lights outside the window, and she grabbed her torch to go and look at it, but they went up towards the sky before she could open the window. The player can do some evidence collection now and gather the following core clues along with some others. Don't forget, you don't want to provide your players only with the core clues, as that makes it too easy. So pepper in some of the alternates too. For the sake of this review, I'll just look at the core ones and ignore the red herrings. You can find an address with a heart next to it. This is Walter's address where Lynette is currently hiding. You also find an entry in her diary saying that Walter has called in an expert who gives her the creeps. She's excited about the upcoming War Bonds party and hopes Walter will sneak her in. She also has some kind of description of the colour, and she did a rough kind of drawing of an amoeba-like fog cloud. That's all in her diary. The next one is Land Girls, which is a core scene, and Langston goes to Lynette's workplace and gets through the guards by mentioning her name, but all the time he is watched closely. Hundreds of women are hard at work preparing munitions. A woman in her 30s, Janet Vincent, comes over and tells Langston that the janitors only come on weekends. Langston can then correct her that he's not a janitor. And then she can tell him some more information. Lynette worked here and was a great employee, but she stopped showing up for work about 9 days ago. No, the plant didn't send a letter to her father. She says that the plant is all women. If Langston thinks to challenge her on this, she says, oh, well, except for the guards. And if you use a push, you can find out that there are actually some male scientists working underground. She also knows about the War Bonds party and plans on going there. It's not necessary, but it is worthwhile for her to mention the War Bonds party because that will be a little bit important later. And here we are. So the atomic war bonds. There have been a few hints about this party, and there are more in the alternate scenes as well. The scientists from the Navy munitions should be there to drum up funding, but no coloured people are allowed. So the player has to come up with some other way to get in, potentially as waitstaff or just talking his way in. Basically allow any reasonable plan that the player comes up with. Langston will be pretty much ignored once inside as a black person unless he draws attention to himself. So everyone is there with a bit of a motive just to get money for themselves or to increase their standing. So they're not going to worry about a black person being there, and they're certainly not going to talk to him. So Langston can use this to his advantage to kind of just listen to gossip. And he does overhear a lot of gossip about various things. And eventually he sees Janet Vincent from the factory earlier. And she is surrounded by some men. Depending on how things play out, he might overhear the name Boris. But whether he does or not, he catches the following before the party move away from his range. The old man in the group is working with Adams, Walter Adams, the scientist, and working with rock samples found in a field in Virginia. It seems to absorb radiation and it never cools down. Walter Adams isn't feeling well. He's dead and has been at home the last few days. The old man suggests that he might soon return to his old job in the University of Cincinnati. Langston can tell that the man is not American from his accent. He's Russian, but he might have been living in America for decades. So it's just kind of subtle notes, but Langston is a linguistic specialist as well. You can also notice there are some notes and documents poking out of his pocket that allow access to the munitions plant. Langston can try to steal them, or he can try and look at them to fake them later. And they're all a wide range of variety of outcomes here depending on what Langston decides to do. Also, if you have them or if you saw them, you can go to your contacts to maybe forge them. Okay, so the next core scene is Ocean's solo. If Langston has the stolen or forged papers, he will likely come to the munitions plant at night when the security is lax. Once inside, he goes down the stairs to the lab and sees a massive glass cage with 4 small rooms inside. If he touches the glass, it seems somehow wrong. It's got 3 layers of glass, but the middle one is in constant movement. Langston discovers a small, malleable, colourful globule of rock that is hot to the touch. He also finds a handful of notes written in Russian and some greasy ash on the floor. An alternate scene investigating this reveals it to be human remains, that of Walter Adams. When Langston leaves, he hears a click and he realizes that he's stepped on a pressure plate, a kind of trap. And there is a challenge to avoid the consequences. Don't forget, in one-to-one scenarios, it's generally assumed that as long as the player doesn't do something incredibly suicidal, that they will survive to the end of the scenario. Now, whether they overcome the difficulty at the end, or get caught in the grass, they will understand the whole mystery by the end. So in this case, if he fails the rolls, he will be touched by the color, but he won't be killed until the end, if that's how it goes. Okay, so after returning home, after this, and I think you can play this almost at any point, Langston finds his apartment is open and there is a ragged-looking man in there. He introduces himself as Special Agent Ellison, and he starts to talk, saying, "I saw it. You have to help." But then he collapses and he starts to dissolve, and the remains glow a sickly colour that has never existed on Earth before. There is an alternate scene where you might have met up with Special Agent Ellison earlier and given him some answers. That will come up at the end. Okay, so the next thing is very important. Dmitri, who was Boris's Soviet contact, he wants to make sure he wraps up all the loose ends before doing the deal with Boris. So Langston is walking along after any scene or the next day when someone fires at him. There's a challenge to see if it hits and if it does, how badly. If you spot the shot coming from the townhouse, you can go and inspect it. Once you're in the room, you can find an ID card for Capital Traction Powerhouse in New England. On the back is tomorrow's date, and the time is 21:30. So there's some big meeting happening tomorrow at 9:30 p.m. There's also a notepad on the on the bedside dresser, and if you scribble over it, you can catch the imprint of the previous note, and you find the names Special Agent Ellison with a line going through it, Maurice Miller and Lynette Miller, and each of them have addresses as well. You also find your name. Lynette's name has 2 addresses next to it. One is her own, and the other is Adams's, Walter Adams, which Langston may already recognize from the diary, from Lynette's diary. So now Langston sees that Special Agent Ellison is already dead. There was an attempt made on his own life, but now Maurice Miller and Lynette Miller are in trouble. That's Lynette and her father. So Langston has to choose which one of them to try to save first. If you go after Lynette first, you can talk to her and find out what she knows. You might have to reassure her and tell her that her father sent you. She explains that she sent the letter hoping to not worry her father while she disappeared. And the main clue that you can get here is that she witnessed Walter being killed by something in the cage while Boris just watched and even smiled. She heard something about this making him rich. Boris mentioned, "Oh, this is going to make me rich." But then he saw Lynette, and Lynette ran. If you come here after possibly saving Maurice, there is a gun battle taking place. After sorting this situation out, Langston can find a piece of paper with the same information from the above, in case he didn't already get it from the room. And he figured out the engraved information in the room, but here is the real note. And Lynette just insists that Langston has to stop Boris. Okay, and if you go to save Maurice first, then it's an alternate scene. It's not super important. If you try to save him afterwards, he is already dead. So it's up to the player what to do. Probably for the sake of the mystery, the player should conclude that Lynette is more important to solving the mystery. Okay, so finally we come up to the conclusion called Secret. Langston goes to the meeting place, but Dimitri arrives an hour early, so 8:30, and scopes the place out. He enters 5 minutes after Boris, watching to make sure if anyone has tailed Boris. If Langston goes in before 8 p.m., he will spot Dimitri entering the building. Otherwise, Dimitri will spot him. So Dimitri will allow Langston to confront Boris. Dimitri is also making sure that Boris isn't selling him out, so he wants to see how that plays out. Boris arrives 10 minutes early and is carrying 3 cylinders, each with a gelatinous form of the colour. If Langston confronts Boris first, then Boris kind of crumbles instantly from the shame, and then Dimitri steps in. If Dimitri goes in on his own, before Langston, he quickly makes the exchange with Boris, thanks him for his service to the Soviet Union, hands over $500, and starts to make his escape. As Boris is leaving, he screams as he sees a cloud of colours coming through the exterior wall. It goes straight towards Dimitri. Unless, if Langston has already been fed upon by the colour, it will go straight for Langston. Either way, Dimitri starts firing and Boris tries to escape on a small motorboat. There are a number of possible solutions that the player can come up with, mostly from alternate scenes talking about using electricity and bright lights. And the scenario lists 4 different challenges, but feel free to use anything that the player can come up with. Once Langston is alone in the power plant, assuming he survived, Langston picks up the aluminium case and steps out of the door. Finally is Man of the Hour, the denouement. As Langston shuts the door of the power plant, lights kind of flash over his body and out walks a G-man who says, "You did good, son. Ellison was right about you." Ellison is the deceased FBI detective that dissolved in Langston's apartment. Langston recognizes this new G-man as Clyde Thompson, who is the associate director of the FBI. So maybe he's famous. He offers to clear Langston of any breaches of the law, just hand over the case. I haven't mentioned it before because they're all alternate scenes, but there have been a number of unpleasant run-ins with the law. For example, driving while black. Maybe if he tries to push his way into somewhere and he shouldn't be. If he tries to steal Boris's ID card and gets caught, that can put him in trouble as well. Possibly shooting at people as well, even if he was trying to save Lynette or Maurice, because generally in this time the police would trust white witnesses over black witnesses. So a lot Langston could be looking at many years in prison for this, and this Clyde Thompson is willing to cut a deal with him. Just give me the case. So Langston knows that there's no way, and you can tell the player this, there's no way that he's going to be leaving here with the case. He can, however, if he wants, give a speech about corruption and request immunity for himself and good protection for Lynette, or basically anything else that the player wants. The player will receive the problem, Hoover knows you, for future scenarios, because now you've been in direct contact with the FBI. And finally, have the player describe the monologue as the screen pans out on Langston standing in front of the power plant empty-handed as the FBI G-Man drives away. And that is the end of the scenario. I think it's a very enjoyable one, and it works with a very well-established mythos creature, the color out of space. The only thing that would keep me from wholeheartedly recommending this scenario is all of the racial stuff. This might be very, very difficult for some people to play, whether they've experienced it before or they're uncomfortable with the topic. Especially in a one-to-one game, it can get pretty intense. I would imagine that this would be magnified if you are, say, a white keeper with a black player and you were role-playing some of the police brutality. On the other hand, I think it can also be a very eye-opening experience to role-play being in some of those situations. And the book does give some suggestions on how to play it with caution. But in general, role-playing allows you to step into someone else's shoes, especially in this almost real-world situation. It can really increase your empathy as well. And the one-to-one setting is very intimate, so it will have more of a profound effect. I love D&D, Dungeons and Dragons, but playing as an elf or playing as a dwarf doesn't really help you understand different plights. But playing as different races in the real world, in a semi-realistic setting, could help you understand some of the difficulties. So, yeah, it really depends on you and your players. It's a very sensitive topic, and if you just want to play games for fun or for relaxation, maybe give this one a miss. If it's a topic you're willing to explore for whatever reasons, I think it's great. So I guess that is all for the video. Don't forget to like and subscribe. I would really appreciate it. That's going to be it for Cthulhu Confidential for a while. The new book has not been released yet, but I'll be sure to review the 9 new scenarios in that when it does. That will be 3 for each of the established characters. Okay, so take it easy, guys, and I'll see you next time.